Imagine a face that history is strictly forbidden to see. By the late 19th century, the American frontier was heavily documented by the glass plates of the camera. Generals, scouts, and even captive indigenous chiefs sat rigidly for portraits, their images cataloged in Washington archives. But one man vehemently refused. He believed the camera lens stripped away a fragment of the soul. He never signed a treaty. He never voluntarily lived on a reservation. He could not be bought. He could not be bribed. And he could not be broken. He did not ride into battle wearing the massive, trailing, eagle feather headdresses you have been conditioned to expect. That was for men who sought status. He wore a single red-tailed hawk feather in his hair. A yellow lightning bolt was painted across his face, and his body was dusted with the pale earth of gopher mounds. His name was Tļašuŋke Witko, Crazy Horse. His perceived invincibility was not a matter of luck. It was rooted in a profound, psychological armor forged during a childhood vision quest. As an adolescent, he went alone into the Black Hills, fasting for days without water until his physical limits were shattered. In his delirium, he saw a warrior rising from a lake, riding a horse that seemed to float above the ground. A massive storm broke over the rider. Lightning crashed, and a hail of enemy bullets flew toward him, but they dissolved before touching his skin. A red-backed hawk flew above his head. The vision came with a strict, unbreakable contract. The spirits told him he would remain impervious to the invaders' lead as long as he adhered to absolute selflessness. He was forbidden from fighting for personal glory. He was forbidden from taking a trophy, and he was forbidden from claiming a scalp. In a warrior culture where taking scalps and counting coup was the sole metric of social elevation, Crazy Horse became a lethal anomaly. He did not fight to boast around the campfire. He fought with the cold, single-minded focus of destroying the enemy. He was a shield for his people, not a harvester of the dead. To understand the sheer, unadulterated rage of the Oglala Lakota, you must look at the cynical machinery of American expansion. In 1851, the United States government drafted the Treaty of Fort Laramie. It was a formal, legally binding document guaranteeing the absolute sovereignty of the Sioux over the Powder River country, a pristine, game-rich expanse of the high plains stretching across Wyoming and Montana. But treaties are written on paper, and paper burns easily when it is rubbed against gold. In the early 1862s, prospectors discovered precious metals in the Montana Territory. Suddenly, the guaranteed sovereign land was an obstacle to federal wealth. The U.S. government authorized the establishment of the Bozeman Trail. This was not a simple dirt path. It was a heavy wagon supply route that cut a mechanical scar straight through the sacred hunting grounds of the Lakota. The constant noise, the thousands of grazing draft animals, and the diseases brought by the settlers effectively destroyed the fragile migratory patterns of the American bison, threatening the tribes with immediate starvation. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, calculated invasion. The military marched in and began erecting a chain of wooden forts along the trail to protect the miners. The Oglala, led by the elder statesman Red Cloud and his brilliant young tactician, Crazy Horse, realized a harsh reality. The word of the federal government was entirely worthless. Treaties were merely tactical pauses used by the Americans to consolidate supply lines. The only language the invaders understood was kinetic force. By December 1866, the American garrison at Fort Phil Kearny was in a state of constant, shivering paranoia. The temperature had plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Wood splintered when struck with an axe. Blood froze before it hit the ground. The Lakota had effectively besieged the fort, cutting off their wood-gathering details and harassing their patrols, slowly draining the fort's morale and supplies. Inside the palisades was Captain William J. Fetterman. He was a veteran of the bloody meat grinders of the American Civil War, steeped in the arrogance of traditional military doctrine. He held the indigenous fighters in absolute contempt. He famously boasted to his superiors, "Give me 80 men, and I will ride through the whole Sioux nation." Crazy Horse intended to give him exactly 80 men and a grave. On the freezing morning of December 21, the Lakota executed a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Crazy Horse personally led a small, highly visible group of warriors to attack the fort's wood train. When Fetterman rode out with exactly 80 soldiers to rescue the loggers, the decoy party broke contact and began to retreat up the icy, treacherous slope of Lodge Trail Ridge. Crazy Horse played the role of the wounded, desperate target with terrifying perfection. The key to a successful decoy is making the enemy believe you are vulnerable. Crazy Horse would stop his horse, dismount in the snow, and pretend to check its hooves, allowing the American cavalry to get just within rifle range. The soldiers fired. The bullets missed. The bait was simply too tempting. Fetterman, blinded by his own hubris and the desire for a swift, glorious victory, violated his direct, explicit orders not to pursue past the high ground. He led his command over the crest of the ridge, losing all visual contact with the fort, and dropped down into a blind ravine where the trap was set. Waiting in the frozen sagebrush, buried under the snow with their hands over their mouths to hide the condensation of their breath, were 1,000 Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Despite the lethal cold, many had stripped down to their breechcloths, knowing that heavy buffalo robes would interfere with the rapid drawing of a bowstring. When Crazy Horse gave the signal, the trap snapped shut. It was not a battle, it was an industrial-scale execution. The ambush was so overwhelming, the volley of arrows so thick, that the sky physically darkened. An estimated 40,000 arrows were loosed in a matter of minutes. The entire American command was liquidated in less than half an hour. There was no retreat, and there were no survivors. The official reports of Colonel Henry B. Carrington, the commander of Fort Phil Kearny, who had the grim task of retrieving the bodies, read like a dispatch from hell. He documented the frozen, stripped remains of Fetterman's men. He noted that the corpses were pinned to the frozen earth by dozens of arrows, their blood turned to solid red ice. Carrington's report shattered the illusion of American supremacy on the plains. It proved that the native forces were not disorganized bands of primitive raiders, but a highly disciplined, tactically superior army capable of executing complex, multi-stage maneuvers. A decade later, the United States government repeated its own treachery. A new gold rush erupted, this time in the Black Hills of South Dakota, the absolute spiritual center of the Lakota universe. The treaties were ripped to shreds. The gold-hungry empire marched in once more to protect the trespassers and force the remaining free indigenous bands onto reservations. This campaign culminated on the searing, dusty afternoon of June 25, 1876, along the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana. General George Armstrong Custer, leading the 7th Cavalry, intended to launch a surprise kinetic strike on a massive, sprawling encampment of Lakota and Cheyenne. Custer operated on the flawed assumption that the native warriors would scatter and flee to protect their families at the sight of the blue uniforms. He divided his forces, critically weakening his own command. He rode directly into a buzzsaw. while the elder chief Sitting Bull remained in the camp to protect the non-combatants and maintain the spiritual integrity of the defense. Crazy Horse took command of the counterattack. When Major Marcus Reno's troops assaulted the southern end of the camp, they were instantly repelled, driven into a panicked, bloody retreat across the river, abandoning their weapons in the mud. But the true tactical genius was unleashed against Custer's detachment at the northern end of the village. Crazy Horse did not panic when the shooting started. He calmly performed his rituals, rubbing the dust of a gopher mound onto his skin and tying the single hawk feather into his hair. Then, he rallied his warriors with a battle cry that would echo through the decades. "Hoka hey! Today is a good day to die." This was not a blind, screaming frontal charge. It was a highly coordinated flanking maneuver. While other chiefs engaged Custer from the front, pinning the cavalry in place, Crazy Horse led a massive force of riders up a hidden deep ravine, completely outflanking the 7th Cavalry and slamming into their exposed rear. He compressed the American troops into a tight, panicked pocket on a dusty rise known today as Last Stand Hill. The tactical reality of Little Bighorn is often ignored by mythmakers. The Indians were not armed just with bows. Through aggressive trading, they possessed hundreds of repeating Henry and Winchester rifles. The 7th Cavalry were armed with single-shot Springfield carbines, which notoriously jammed when the copper cartridges expanded in the overheated breeches. Custer's men were reduced to frantically prying jammed casings out of their rifles with knives while under heavy fire. The testimonies of indigenous survivors, such as the Northern Cheyenne warrior Wooden Leg, described a scene of absolute blinding chaos. The air was so choked with alkaline dust and thick gray gun smoke that men fought blind, swinging rifle butts and war clubs. Wooden Leg recounted how the deafening roar of repeating rifles and the screams of dying horses turned the hill into a slaughterhouse. Crazy Horse rode directly through the American lines, his hawk feather cutting through the smoke, untouchable, breaking the last defensive formations of the cavalry. Custer's entire detachment of 210 men was wiped off the map. It was the greatest indigenous victory in the history of the continent, but it was also the beginning of the end. The Lakota won the Battle of Little Bighorn, but they could not win the physics of the war. The United States military, humiliated and enraged by the loss of their golden general, stopped trying to outfight the Lakota and decided to simply starve them. General George Crook and Colonel Nelson A. Miles launched a relentless, total war winter campaign. They bypassed the warriors and targeted the logistics. They destroyed the massive herds of bison, deliberately liquidating the indigenous supply chain. They attacked the winter camps, burning the teepees and destroying the caches of dried meat, forcing the bands out into the sub-zero blizzards without food or shelter. By the spring of 1877, Crazy Horse faced a grim, inescapable calculus. His people were freezing. His warriors were emaciated, their bodies consuming their own muscle tissue just to stay warm. The infants were dying of starvation. The man who had never lost a battle to the Americans realized he had to sacrifice his own absolute freedom to keep his people alive. He could not fight the weather, and he could not fight the limitless treasury of the U.S. government. In May of 1877, under the promise of a peaceful settlement and a reservation in his own homeland of the Powder River, Crazy Horse led his ragged, exhausted band into Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and surrendered his weapons. The American command was terrified of him. Even without a rifle, his sheer presence commanded absolute, unbreakable loyalty from the tribes. Rumors, fueled by jealous reservation chiefs and paranoid military officers, began to circulate that he was planning a massive breakout. The military establishment decided to preemptively neutralize the threat. On September 5, 1877, under the guise of a diplomatic meeting with the post commander, they lured him to the adjutant's office. When he arrived, he was directed instead toward the guardhouse. When Crazy Horse stepped through the door and saw the iron bars and the heavy chains bolted to the floor, the deception was laid bare. The ghost of the plains would not be caged. He drew a hidden knife and fought wildly, slashing at the guards, trying to escape back into the open air. In the ensuing violent struggle, a former Lakota ally turned reservation policeman, a man named Little Bighorn, grabbed Crazy Horse's arms from behind to restrain him. As his arms were pinned, an American infantry guard, Private William Gentles, lunged forward and drove his rifle bayonet deep into Crazy Horse's abdomen, piercing his kidneys. Crazy Horse collapsed onto the hard, packed earth of the fort. The post surgeon, Dr. Valentine McGillicuddy, tried desperately to save him, but the internal trauma was catastrophic. Dr. McGillicuddy's eyewitness accounts detail the final agonizing hours of the great tactician. The soldiers tried to move him onto a cot to make him comfortable, but Crazy Horse violently refused. He had never slept in the white man's bed, and he would not die in one. He lay on the cold floor, his father weeping beside him. In his final breaths, he whispered to McGillicuddy that he had only ever wanted to be left alone, to hunt on the land of his ancestors. He died just before midnight. The United States Army had finally eliminated their greatest nightmare, but they could not capture his legacy. Under the cover of darkness, his parents took his body away into the desolate, winding canyons of the Badlands, hiding his bones in a location that remains undiscovered to this day. He left no photograph to be filed away in a cabinet. He left no signature on a broken treaty. He left only the terrifying, unvarnished truth of a man who fought an empire to a standstill, relying on nothing but the speed of his horse, the sharpness of his mind, and the absolute conviction that his land was not for sale. History is never what you think.